Well, our Christmas series this year is titled Heaven and Nature Sing. Each Sunday for the month of December, we've been looking at a different Christmas carol, learning about the history of that carol, the author of the carol, what inspired them to write the song, and talking about the theology of the carol and what it teaches about Jesus and his incarnation. Today, we're going to be looking at the song, O Little Town of Bethlehem, which is hymn number 410 in your hymnal. Normally, I'd say reach out and take a hymnal from in front of you, but you might actually have to take one from the seat across from you or get out of your seat and reach underneath the seat to get it because our seats are set up a little bit different. But if you'd like to follow along when we get to it in a moment, it's hymn number 410. This was actually the first carol that we've talked about that we still sing pretty much the way it was written in 1868. It's also the newest of the carols which we're talking about. All the others were written before it, most of them in the 1700s. But this one has pretty much stayed intact from the day it was written. All the other carols, you remember we talked about, they were written by one person and changed by somebody else, and then even the melody was changed to bring us to what we have today. This carol we still sing pretty much the way it was originally written. The words to O Little Town of Bethlehem were written by Philip Brooks. Brooks is recognized as one of the most outstanding preachers of all time. Many volumes of his messages have been published, and they're required reading in many seminaries for those going into ministry. In 1862, 1 year after the Civil War started, Brooks took the pastorate of his first church, Holy Trinity Church in Philadelphia. Brooks was only in his mid-20s when he took the church, but it was a perfect church for someone just starting in ministry. The church was small, barely running 50 people when he began. But within the first year, it had grown to over 1,000 in attendance. The phenomenal growth was a combination of Brooks' dynamic preaching and the skills of Lewis Redner, who you'll also see in the bottom of the page there as part of the song. Redner was a talented organist that Brooks had hired to lead worship and run the Sunday school department. For several years, the church continued to grow. But as the war dragged on, the mood in the church became somber. Most of the women were wearing black due to a husband or a son who had been killed in battle. And it seemed like a deep darkness had fallen over every facet of the church services. Brooke tried his best to be inspirational and encourage his people, but each week he would go home drained. When the war ended, Brooks thought the vitality and joy would return immediately, but it didn't. Then Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Brooks was asked to preach the president's funeral. Brooks was not Lincoln's pastor, but his great oratory skills, even at such a young age, had become well known. He reached down deep to find the appropriate words to say for such an occasion. But when he returned home, he was so burned out that he was finding it difficult to rekindle his own spiritual flame. So he asked the church for a sabbatical and took a trip to the Holy Land. It was Christmas Eve in Jerusalem when he mounted a horse and went for a ride. At dusk, when the first stars had come out, he rode into the tiny village of Bethlehem. The town had changed very little since the birth of Christ. He found himself sitting right outside the Church of the Nativity, which is believed to be located at the exact spot where Christ was born. There was singing coming from the church, and as he listened to the music, he felt that he was surrounded by the Spirit of God. When he returned home, he wanted to express the stirring that he felt in his soul on that night. He decided that it would be best to communicate in a poem. After completing the poem, he gave it to his organist, Lewis Redner, and asked him to put it to music. The result was the song which we're looking at this morning. The song is based on a prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which reads, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." Micah prophesied that the greatest gift ever given would not come in an impressive package. That's why so many people miss the greatest event that has ever happened in the history of the world, even though Micah and other prophets gave hints as to what should be expected. Very few people paid any attention to those prophecies because it didn't fit into their preconceived ideas of how a gift of that magnitude should be packaged. Let's look first at the passage from Micah, and then we'll look at some of the other ways that Jesus didn't fit into the expectation of how a gift should be packaged. Micah starts with the words, "You, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you are small." Small is probably an understatement. Bethlehem was hardly even large enough to be considered a town. It was located about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Bethlehem was so small that both Joshua and Nehemiah didn't even think it was worth mentioning when they listed the cities in Judah. They just bypassed it completely, said nobody cares about that small town. Very few people except the locals probably even knew it existed. It would be like trying to tell someone in New York that you lived in Harrow, Washington. It's estimated that even though Bethlehem had been in existence for years, in fact, it was one of the cities that was already there when the Israelites came into Canaan. Bethlehem was a city they simply took over. It wasn't one they built. It had been there for ages. But at the time of Christ, it had only grown to, highest estimates say, 150 people. Bethlehem is first mentioned in Genesis 35, 16 through 20. As Jacob and his family are traveling back to Canaan after living with Jacob's uncle Laban for years, Rachel went into labor and gave birth to her second son, Benjamin. She died while giving birth and was buried just outside of Bethlehem. We see that in Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 to 19. They moved on from Bethel. While they were there, still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni. But his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. There were other notable events and people that had come from Bethlehem also. The story of Ruth both begins and ends in Bethlehem. King David was born and raised in Bethlehem, and it was in Bethlehem that he was anointed king. But even though Bethlehem had some history, it wasn't a popular destination. It was too small even to be listed on most maps. If you were from Bethlehem and someone asked where you were from, you would likely respond, "I live in a small village about 5 miles south of Jerusalem," because they wouldn't know where Bethlehem was. Everybody knew where Jerusalem was. It was much more impressive to say you were from Jerusalem or from the Jerusalem area than to state that you were from Bethlehem. Notice that Micah uses 2 names for Bethlehem. The first name is the name that it was known for at the time of Micah, and the other name, Ephratah, is the longer version of the original name which we read in Genesis when we talked about Rachel. Bethlehem did not have a thriving economy. The only reason it existed was because the hills around Bethlehem were a great place to graze sheep. The various sheep ranchers got together and built a small town for their families to live in and to have a little more comfort while the men were out with the sheep. Unless you raise sheep for a living, no one would even consider living in Bethlehem because there wasn't anything to offer. They didn't have a shopping mall. They had nothing to do. No restaurants. Children couldn't wait to grow up and move to someplace better. I can't wait until I'm old and get my own place. I'm moving out of here and I'm never coming back. But even though Bethlehem was insignificant in the eyes of men, it wasn't unnoticed by God. He knew exactly where to find David when he was looking for a godly king to rule his people. Often we feel that we're insignificant. We say, if I just had more talent, if I lived in a different place, if I had more money. We buy into this idea that God only sees important people. And since we aren't important, God doesn't notice us. God saw David while he was sitting on a hillside outside of Bethlehem, surrounded by a flock of stinky sheep. And he picked Bethlehem, of all places, to introduce his son into the world. Don't let anybody convince you that God doesn't know about you. God knows you. In fact, he knows how many hairs are on your head. For some of you, that's easy. Some of you, that's a little more difficult. But God knows you better than you know yourself. All throughout history, God has used insignificant people to carry out his plan. Abraham was a nobody until God called him, and Abraham stepped out in obedience. God didn't choose Moses while he was a prince living in a palace. God waited until Moses was a fugitive, watching sheep in the wilderness. David was on the bottom of Samuel's list when Samuel was looking for the next king of Israel, but David was on the top of God's list. Gideon, the mighty warrior, was the least likely to lead an army into battle. But God didn't choose a man who was already a great man of war. He looked for someone who would be obedient and humbly give themselves to God. Jesus didn't choose politicians, doctors, lawyers, and other educated people to be part of the inner core of his ministry. He could. That doesn't say those people can't be part of ministry, but too often they think they know it all and they're not going to submit. Jesus chose fishermen and other societal outcasts. Martin Luther began his life as the insignificant son of a German copper smelter. William Carey, the missionary, was a small-town shoemaker, but became one of the greatest missionaries in history. Billy Graham was the son of a small dairy farmer. But getting back to the Christmas story, when God was looking for a couple to raise his son here on earth, he didn't look for someone of high social status. He chose a young peasant girl and a common carpenter. We might think that we're insignificant compared to others, that we see regularly in the news and on television, and most of us will never be important or well known as far as the world is concerned. But every one of us is important to God. He knows every little detail about us. He knows our name. He knows our every thought. That's scary. He sees each tear that falls. And he hears us when we call. Some of us, sometimes we think, well, he listens to the Billy Grahams and, the big name preachers before he listens to us. That's not true. He hears everything you say, even the things you don't want him to hear you say. So how much more does he listen to the prayers? The Israelites were anxiously waiting for the promised Messiah, but they were waiting for him to arrive in a big fancy package. Other than an angelic choir and a bright star in the sky, there was nothing fancy about the way that Jesus came into the world. And even though his birth was announced by a choir of angels, the only people that saw the angels were a few lonely shepherds. And only a few men noticed the star. Not at all like the birth of other royalty throughout history. Think about all the publicity and announcements that are made anytime the English royal family has a new baby born. Man, it's broadcast all over the news. Everybody knows, and all the tabloids are posting pictures. Everybody's got to meet the new prince. Or even a celebrity when they have a child. Somebody that we see as a famous movie star, a football player or somebody. When they have kids, everybody knows about it. God chose an insignificant couple to raise his child. Now think about it for a moment. John the Baptist was born the son of the high priest. Jesus was the son of a common carpenter. Does that make sense? I think it should have been the other way around. I think maybe the stork got his directions mixed up when he delivered the two babies and delivered them to the wrong house. The Jews probably would have been more likely to accept Jesus as Messiah if he had been born the son of a high priest. But God didn't choose to have his son born the son of a high priest. He had a humble peasant woman and a carpenter raise his son. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 to 29 says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." So God didn't choose someone important to raise his son. He chose someone of lowly, humble nature, a peasant girl and a common carpenter. And God didn't send his son as a mighty warrior or a mighty ruler. He sent his son as a helpless infant who would grow up to be a humble servant and die the most disgraceful and humiliating death ever created. Not only did God deliver his son to a small, insignificant couple, he also had him be born in a small, insignificant town. Instead of a big city, instead of a place that had lots of things for a child to do and lots of people to notice, he sent him to a little town in the middle of nowhere. And he was born possibly in a barn. But we know he spent his first night in a feeding trough, surrounded by animals and smelly shepherds. Ken Geyer, in his book, Infinite Moments with the Savior, writes, "Where you would have expected angels, there were only flies. Where you would have expected heads of state, there were only donkeys, a few haltered cows, a nervous ball of sheep, a tethered camel, and a furtive scurry of barn mice. Of course, we don't know for sure all those things were there, but we do know those that would normally be there to welcome a prince into the world weren't there. The world was waiting for a great gift to arrive in a great package. But when the gift was delivered, it was rejected by most people because it didn't fit their preconceived idea of how that gift should be packaged. I read a sad story about a young man that asked his father for a car for graduation. He had picked out the car that he wanted. He gave all the information to his father. He said, this is the dealership, this is the color, even gave the VIN number. This is the car I want for my graduation present. He was convinced that he was going to get the car. So when graduation day came, his dad presented him with a small box. And he just knew that inside that small box, there were going to be keys for his brand new car. But instead, what he found in the box was a leather-bound Bible with his name engraved on it. The young man was furious. He threw the Bible at his father and he stomped out of the house, never to return again. Many years passed. The young man never spoke to his father or visited his father. Then one day he received news that his father had passed away. He needed to return home to settle the estate. He thought to himself, perhaps I will inherit something of value. Something that will repay me for all these years of agony and repay me for that gift that I should have received when I graduated. As he was going through his father's belongings, he found the Bible that he'd been given for graduation, that he had never opened. As he began to thumb through the Bible, a folded piece of paper fell out and onto the floor. He picked up the paper, and when he opened it, he discovered a title to the car that he had picked out for himself. The car had been paid in full. All he had to do was go to the dealership and claim his car, but he never got it because what he received didn't look like what he thought he was going to get. He quickly ran to the car dealership to claim his car. Maybe it would still be there after all these years. I mean, it was paid for. It was his car, but he found the dealership had closed 3 years earlier, and the car had been donated to charity. A little over 2,000 years ago, God gave us the greatest gift that has ever been given. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." Unfortunately, many people, even though they claimed that they were looking for the gift, missed it because it wasn't packaged the way they thought it should be packaged. In the words of Dr. Seuss, the first Christmas gift, God's Son, the promised Messiah, came without ribbons. It came without tags. It came without packages, boxes, or bags. The greatest gift that we could ever give or receive is Jesus. It may not look that impressive on the outside. Many people will never open the gift because they're looking for something more spectacular. Certainly that couldn't be God's promised Messiah. God would reserve the Hilton. God would make an announcement. That couldn't be what the world's been waiting for. And that's what today's song talks about. It talks about the grand events that happened in such an unassuming way. It says, "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." Bethlehem went on just as it always had. Other than the shepherds coming in the middle of the night, which wasn't even unusual. Sometimes shepherds would come back into town in the middle of the night, leave some to watch the sheep and go back in to pick up supplies or maybe to do their laundry or something. But for the most part, it went on just like it always did. A small, quiet, unassuming town. Yet in the dark streets came the everlasting light. Second verse says, for Christ is born of Mary. Again, it's insignificant. Not somebody that we would pick to raise somebody of that magnitude, but he was born to Mary and gathered all above. While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. O morning stars together proclaim thy holy birth, and praises sing to God the King, and peace to men on earth. How silently the wondrous gift is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. That's the story of how Christ came. There was no big announcement. There was no big celebration. Just a humble child born to a peasant couple in a small town. And it wasn't even their own town. The gift was given to the whole world. But most of the world missed it. In the last verse, Brooks transitions from the story of how it happened to what our response should be once we realize what has happened. The fourth verse is a prayer asking Jesus to live within us. Jesus spent his first night sleeping in a manger because no room could be found for him anywhere in Bethlehem. If people really understood what was taking place, surely they would have invited him in. But they didn't know. And they didn't really care to know. I mean, if I knew this was Christ's son, I would have said, here, you can have my room tonight. You can have my bed. But everybody said, it's just a peasant girl. We've seen them before. We got them all over town. People were too busy just living their lives to pay heed to a pregnant woman and a little baby. But what's our excuse? We know the story. We know who the baby was. We know what he came to do, or at least we claim we do. The promise is that anyone who believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So what will we do with Christ? Will we ignore him? Will we say, I'm just going to keep doing business as usual? I'm just going to keep living my life. I'm too busy. Yeah, I know he was the Son of God, but I just don't have time for it right now. I'm going to put that on hold. If we know what happened, if we know who Jesus was and know why he came, we need to do something with it. Will we give him a place to live? Will we say there's room here in my heart? The fourth verse says, O holy child of Bethlehem. It's a prayer. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us. We could change that to me. Descend to me, I pray. Cast out our sin and enter in. Be born in us. Don't find a stable. Don't find a manger somewhere. Be born in me. I've got room in my heart. We hear the Christmas angels. Brooks says as he stood outside that church in Bethlehem and he heard the music coming from the church, it was as if the angelic choir was singing. He said he seemed like he was hearing the voices of angels proclaiming the birth of the Messiah, and that's the boost that he needed. He got over his depression. He went back home energized and continued to preach for the rest of his life because he grasped on to that miracle that had taken place. We hear the Christmas angels, the great glad tidings tell. Oh, come to us, abide with us, our Lord, Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us.